He wasn't just a driver, he was a lifesaver. But the officer never saw it coming. The afternoon sun blazed over the city streets, painting a vivid picture of life bustling with energy. It was just another day, or so it seemed. On a road lined with faded storefronts and well-worn sidewalks, a sleek red sports car rolled forward, its engine humming a melody of power and precision. Heads turned as the car passed, pedestrians stopping mid-step to marvel at its beauty. The glossy finish reflected the sunlight like a polished gem, and its driver, a black man in his early 30s, wore a crisp white shirt that seemed to defy the heat. He leaned back confidently, his aviator sunglasses concealing his sharp gaze. Traffic slowed as the light turned red. The man brought the car to a smooth stop, drumming his fingers lightly on the steering wheel. To his left, a police cruiser idled, its faded paint and older model a stark contrast to the car it pulled alongside. Inside the cruiser sat a white officer, mid-40s, his face weathered from years on the job. His eyes flicked toward the red car, and then again, lingering this time. The man in the car noticed, but didn't react, his expression as still as the air before a summer storm. The officer, however, leaned forward slightly, his suspicion evident. To him, the scene didn't add up. A car like this, here, now, driven by someone like him. The officer's hand drifted to the radio. The light turned green, but the red sports car didn't make it far. A sharp chirp of a siren cut through the hum of city life. Pedestrians paused, their eyes darting toward the scene. The cruiser's lights flickered to life, red and blue bouncing off the sleek body of the car as it rolled to a halt by the curb. From the car window, the man glanced at his rearview mirror, calm and composed. He exhaled deeply, his fingers still resting lightly on the wheel. The officer stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his belt as he approached. His face was hard, his posture rigid. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered, his voice carrying a weight that drew attention. The man complied, his movements measured and deliberate, like someone well practiced in handling these situations. His crisp shirt seemed to glow against the sunlit backdrop, a sharp contrast to the growing tension in the air. Pedestrians began to gather, their murmurs swelling as they exchanged glances. Some pulled out their phones, their cameras pointed at the unfolding scene. The man stood by his car, hands at his sides, calm but watchful. The officer, however, eyed the car's luxurious interior and frowned. "This car doesn't match your profile," the officer muttered, his words laced with doubt. But as the crowd grew, and phones captured every angle, it was clear this was no ordinary traffic stop. Something far deeper was about to unfold. The officer gestured for the man to step further away from the car, his expression unreadable but his tone unrelenting. "License and registration," he demanded, his eyes darting between the man and the car as though searching for cracks in a story not yet told. The man reached into his pocket with deliberate slowness, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. From it, he retrieved his license and registration, handing them over without a word. His movements were calm, deliberate. Almost too calm, the officer thought. It unnerved him. "What's your business here?" the officer pressed, flipping the license over in his hand. The man raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly, as though the question was both unnecessary and amusing. "I was heading home," he replied evenly, his voice carrying a quiet confidence that didn't match the scene unfolding. The officer glanced back at the red sports car. The leather seats, the custom dashboard, the faint scent of newness that seemed to cling to it. It screamed wealth, privilege, something this man didn't appear to fit into. Not here, not now. The murmurs of the growing crowd began to swell, whispers spreading like wildfire. Why'd he pull him over? Is it just because of the car? He didn't do anything wrong. Phones were raised higher, their lenses capturing every angle of the interaction. The officer's shoulders stiffened as he turned toward the crowd. He felt their eyes on him, judging, waiting. "Stand back," the officer barked, waving his arm. But the crowd didn't budge, their expressions a mix of concern and defiance. The man glanced at the growing number of people. A faint smile played on his lips, almost as if he welcomed their presence. It was a strange kind of reassurance, one that made the officer's frown deepen. Returning his attention to the driver, the officer held up the documents. "This car, where did you get it?" "I bought it," the man replied, his tone sharp now. "With my money." The officer's jaw tightened. "What do you do for a living?" The man's smile widened just a fraction. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." The officer stepped closer, the space between them narrowing. The crowd collectively held its breath. "I'll decide what I believe," the officer said, his voice low, almost a growl. The man tilted his head, his sunglasses catching the sunlight and reflecting the officer's own face back at him. "I'm a surgeon," he said, the words landing with weight. "I save lives for a living." The officer blinked, caught off guard for just a second. But doubt quickly replaced the surprise. He reached for his radio, speaking into it with clipped efficiency, his eyes never leaving the man. "Running ID now. Stay where you are." The driver nodded once, crossing his arms as he leaned slightly against his car. He didn't speak, didn't move, but the air between him and the officer crackled with unspoken tension. The radio crackled back. "Confirming identity. Stand by." But even as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the energy of the crowd shifted, their whispers giving way to a mounting anticipation. Something was about to change, and no one could look away. The officer's radio buzzed to life, breaking the tense silence. "Confirming identity," the dispatcher repeated, their tone cautious. As the officer turned slightly, his focus still on the man, the driver adjusted his posture, standing tall and composed. He appeared utterly unaffected by the unfolding drama, though his silence spoke volumes. The crowd, now a mix of curious onlookers and concerned residents, murmured louder. "What's taking so long?" someone whispered. Another voice chimed in. "He's got to be legit. Look at how calm he is." The officer, still gripping the man's license, glanced toward the crowd, visibly uneasy. It wasn't just the phone cameras that unnerved him. It was the man's unshakable confidence, as though he'd seen this play out before. The driver finally broke his silence. "You ever think it's exhausting?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough weight to reach the officer. "What's exhausting?" the officer snapped, more defensive than curious. "Being assumed guilty before you even get a chance to speak," the man replied, his gaze unwavering. "It's tiring, but you get used to it." The crowd quieted slightly, as though his words had momentarily stilled the air. The officer scoffed, unwilling to engage. Instead, he turned back to his radio. "What's the holdup on that ID?" The dispatcher's voice finally came through, firmer now. "Identity confirmed. That's Dr. Malcolm Rhodes, renowned cardiothoracic surgeon. He's been practicing for over 8 years. No criminal record. Clean as they come." The officer blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. He stared at the ID in his hand, then back at Malcolm, who stood there with the same calm expression. "You're a surgeon?" the officer asked, his tone now carrying an edge of disbelief. "That's what I said," Malcolm replied, his voice steady. He glanced toward the crowd, and then back to the officer. "And for the record, I just finished volunteering at the St. Mark's Free Clinic just down the road. Maybe you've heard of it." The officer's face reddened, his composure cracking. "Why didn't you mention that earlier?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Would it have made a difference?" For the first time, the officer had no retort. The crowd stirred again, their whispers now tinged with admiration and indignation. A woman stepped forward, phone in hand. "Dr. Rhodes, you're the one who helped my uncle last year. He wouldn't be alive without you," she called out. Her words seemed to ripple through the gathering, others nodding in recognition. The officer's discomfort grew as he realized the crowd wasn't just a group of bystanders, they were a community. And Malcolm Rhodes wasn't just a driver in a fancy car. He was someone they respected, someone who had made a tangible difference in their lives. But as the weight of the moment bore down, it became clear this wasn't just about one man's identity. It was about challenging the assumptions that led to this moment. The weight of the dispatcher's words settled heavily on the officer's shoulders. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at the man before him, who seemed utterly unbothered by the entire ordeal. Malcolm adjusted his sunglasses slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering, as if he'd expected this moment to unfold, just as it had. The crowd, no longer just murmuring, began to voice their opinions louder now. "This is ridiculous," a man said from the front. "He's a doctor. You stopped him because of a car." Another chimed in. "This is what happens every time someone looks like us and has something nice." The officer shifted uncomfortably, his grip on Malcolm's license tightening before he handed it back. He cleared his throat, avoiding Malcolm's gaze. "You are free to go," he said flatly, though his tone lacked the authority it carried earlier. Malcolm didn't move. He remained standing by his car, looking at the officer with an expression that was calm but piercing. "That's it?" he asked. The officer's face hardened. "What else do you want?" Malcolm took a step closer, but his voice remained calm. "How about an acknowledgement? An apology, even? Because whether you'll admit it or not, this had nothing to do with my car. It had everything to do with me." The crowd fell silent again, waiting for the officer's response. The tension was palpable, the kind that demanded resolution. The officer's eyes flickered toward the growing crowd. Phones were raised, recording every second. He was boxed in, and he knew it. Finally, he exhaled deeply, his voice low. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, though even he didn't seem convinced by his own excuse. Malcolm tilted his head, his voice now carrying a slight edge. "No," he said firmly, "what you did wasn't just about your job. It was a judgment call, and you made the wrong one. You looked at me and decided I didn't belong." The words hung in the air, a heavy truth that couldn't be ignored. The officer opened his mouth as if to respond, but stopped himself. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked back to his cruiser, his shoulders stiff with frustration and shame. Malcolm watched him go, his expression unreadable. Turning to the crowd, he gave a small nod of acknowledgement, before stepping back toward his car. But before he could leave, an older woman stepped forward, her voice breaking the silence. "Dr. Rhodes, thank you for everything you've done for this community," she said, her words filled with sincerity. "We know who you are, even if some people don't." The crowd erupted into applause, their appreciation for Malcolm drowning out the officer's retreating footsteps. Malcolm, moved by the gesture but maintaining his composure, gave the crowd a small wave before stepping into his car. But as the engine roared to life and the car pulled away, the echoes of the crowd's applause left behind a question. When will assumptions like these finally end? The red sports car glided down the road, the roar of its engine fading into the distance. Malcolm drove in silence, his mind steady despite the weight of what had just transpired. It wasn't the first time he'd faced such assumptions, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Yet, this time felt different. The crowd's support, their voices rising in his defense, gave him a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a while. Hope. At a stoplight, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. For a moment, his calm facade cracked, and the weariness of carrying these battles on his shoulders showed. He took a deep breath, adjusting his sunglasses, and as the light turned green, he pressed forward. Back at the scene, the crowd lingered, their conversations charged with frustration and determination. "This has to stop," one man said, shaking his head. "We can't let this keep happening." Another woman added, "Dr. Rhodes shouldn't have to prove himself just to exist. None of us should." Their words echoed a sentiment that had been building for generations. The incident was more than just a traffic stop. It was a reflection of a deeper issue, one that demanded change. For the officer sitting in his cruiser, the weight of what had happened began to settle. He stared out the window, watching the crowd disperse, their disappointed gazes lingering in his mind. This wasn't just another routine stop. It was a moment he couldn't ignore, no matter how much he wanted to. Meanwhile, Malcolm arrived at his modest home a few miles away, the same neighborhood where he'd grown up. He parked the car and stepped out, greeted by a group of children playing on the sidewalk. "Cool car, Dr. Rhodes," one of them called out, grinning. Malcolm smiled, crouching down to meet their eager eyes. "It's not just about the car," he said. "It's about what you work for. Never let anyone tell you what you can't achieve." The kids nodded, their faces lighting up with admiration. As Malcolm stood and headed inside, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just driving that car for himself. It was a symbol for those who needed to see what was possible, despite the barriers. The story didn't end on that street corner. It lived on in the recordings shared online, sparking discussions and debates across the country. Some condemned the officer's actions, others defended them. But one thing was clear. The incident forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and privilege. In a world that often judged people by their appearances, Malcolm's composure and the crowd's support served as a powerful reminder. Assumptions can be broken, but only if people are willing to see beyond the surface. To those watching this story today, remember this. Every small act of courage, every time someone stands up against prejudice, it plants the seeds for a better tomorrow. Let's challenge our own biases and make a change, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that matter. Together, we can make a difference.